The Dark Scrolls. The walls of Kashtaisi Castle had always been cold, but no one could have known they would drink in so much blood. Long before her name became a whispered curse across the valleys of Hungary, Elizabeth Báthory was born into privilege so absolute it bent the world around her. She came screaming into existence in 1560 in a chamber adorned with tapestries and iron candelabras, while a midwife crossed herself and murmured that something unnatural had slipped into the noble line. Perhaps it was only fear of the Báthory power that kept such suspicions locked behind tight lips. Her family was old as the kingdom itself, lords, bishops, warlords who had crushed uprisings with merciless efficiency. No one dared imagine the darkness that their most brilliant daughter would become. Her childhood was steeped in the rituals of aristocracy. Servants flitted around her like pale moths, responding to her every whim with downcast eyes. From her mother she learned the art of noble cruelty, the casual slap to a maid's cheek, the way a child's hunger could be used to discipline an entire household. But there were other lessons too, the ones that took root deeper. She saw a man sewn alive into the belly of a dying horse as punishment for theft, heard his muffled screams until the castle's stones were soaked with their echoes. She was 6. No one thought to question how such visions shaped her. To be Báthory was to inherit a legacy of power and dominance, and she wore it like an heirloom gown. By adolescence, she was tall, almost statuesque, with a face that could be tender in one moment and blistering with contempt in the next. Suitors came from across the kingdom, eager to secure an alliance with one of the wealthiest families in Europe. It was in these years she became engaged to Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier renowned for his ferocity on the battlefield. Their marriage was celebrated with feasts and solemn Latin blessings, but those who attended recalled something hollow in her smile, as if she were already rehearsing a role she never truly wanted. Ferenc was away more often than he was home, leading campaigns against the Ottoman Turks, and in his absence Elizabeth governed their estates alone. It was then she began to exercise her authority with a zeal that made even seasoned retainers uneasy. A servant girl who failed to polish a silver goblet was struck so hard her teeth broke against the floor. Another was locked in a windowless pantry for days until she emerged half delirious and bruised. Yet these cruelties were not exceptional in the noble households of the day. They were almost expected. What set Elizabeth apart was the relish with which she administered them. Over time, a dark satisfaction gleamed behind her eyes, a hunger she could no longer disguise. Some whispered that she felt a thrill when others suffered, that her pulse quickened at the sight of blood. Few dared to confirm whether such rumors were true. When Ferenc returned from war, he taught her new refinements in punishment, how a thin sliver of oiled paper could be threaded between the toes and set alight, how freezing water could be poured over naked skin and left to crystallize. These techniques were passed between them like tokens of intimacy. Together they created a private theater of torment, where the cries of servant girls became the soundtrack to their union. No one could have guessed these experiments were only the beginning. In the autumn of 1604, Ferenc fell ill. Some said it was a war wound that festered unseen. Others suspected poison. He died slowly, and Elizabeth was at his bedside when he took his final rattling breath. In that instant, something in her unspooled. The loneliness she had always carried became a bottomless pit. But it wasn't only grief that flooded in. It was a sense of liberation so profound she could scarcely contain it. Now she was the undisputed mistress of all Nadasdy lands, hundreds of villages, sprawling forests, and the brooding castle itself. The tenants paid tribute to her in livestock and coin. The lesser nobles deferred to her judgment. She was not merely wealthy. She was sovereign in all but name. And with that sovereignty came the freedom to explore appetites no longer restrained by her husband's presence. The first disappearances were small enough to go unnoticed. A peasant girl sent to serve in the laundry never returned to her family. Another vanished from the kitchens after breaking a plate. No one dared question Elizabeth directly. Her reputation as a disciplinarian was already well established, and the peasants believed the price of disobedience was sometimes death. But soon a pattern emerged. New servants were always being hired. Some were seen arriving in wagons under cover of dusk. Fewer and fewer were seen leaving. In the villages below, mothers began locking their daughters indoors at night, and fathers crossed themselves when they passed the castle road. Those with means sent their children to distant relatives, praying the countess's hunger would turn elsewhere. In the privacy of her chambers, Elizabeth studied herself in the mirror. Each year etched the faintest lines around her eyes. Some mornings she woke to find her skin looked sallow and tired, and she was seized by a terror so primal it left her trembling. To age was to decay. To decay was to die. She could not accept it. She would not. It was during this time that the most enduring legend of her life was born. One evening, as she struck a young maid across the face, a spatter of blood landed on the back of her hand. Later, she imagined that the place where the blood had touched her skin appeared smoother, fairer, renewed. She pressed her fingers to the spot over and over, as if willing the transformation to spread. Whether this was delusion or a moment of genuine conviction, no one could say. But it became her obsession. Soon after, the punishments grew more elaborate. Girls were stripped naked and hung by the wrists, their throats opened with a small, precise blade. Warm blood collected in brass bowls, then poured into her bath. She would step in carefully, feeling the heat soak into her flesh and close her eyes as the liquid lapped at her collarbone. In that darkness, she imagined herself transformed. No longer a widow, no longer a woman marked by time, but something eternal. The staff watched in terror. Some fled into the night, abandoning their positions without pay. Others remained because they could not afford to leave, or because they feared her wrath more than any horror their conscience could conjure. Those who stayed learned to be complicit. They buried bodies in shallow forest graves, scrubbed gore from the flagstones, and sewed up the bloodied linens. And always Elizabeth demanded more. The thrill of each new death waned quickly, replaced by an emptiness that could only be filled by fresh screams. She began sending agents to recruit peasant girls under false promises of employment or education. In a time of famine and war, the desperation of the poor was a bottomless well she could draw from endlessly. When the nights were long and the wind rattled the shutters, the villagers swore they heard the howls of the dying drifting down the hills. A chill settled over the land as if the soil itself had grown afraid. And in the high tower, Elizabeth Báthory bathed in darkness and waited for the dawn to show her the face of youth she believed she deserved. Even as the countryside whispered of her atrocities, Elizabeth moved with the poise of a woman who believed herself untouchable. She had inherited more than lands and titles. She had inherited the confidence of centuries of Báthory dominion, the knowledge that no accusation could ever reach high enough to bring her down. The petty complaints of peasants were as insignificant to her as the insects crushed under her heel. Her confidence was not entirely unfounded. Among the nobility, she was still received with deference. When she traveled, her carriages were draped in crimson and black, her retinue larger than most barons could afford. She dined with bishops, lent funds to struggling lords, and made strategic alliances that secured her a web of protection. In public, she wore the trappings of piety, donating coins to the churches, endowing a school for young noblemen. But in private, her hunger grew so vast it swallowed any pretense of virtue. It was not enough to take the lives of peasants anymore. Their suffering had become dull, predictable. She began to crave something richer, something more dangerous. So she turned her gaze to the daughters of minor gentry, girls who were educated, pretty, accustomed to finer things. girls whose absence could not be ignored for long. She sent out carefully worded invitations, promising positions as ladies' companions and tutors. She flattered their parents with talk of refinement and advancement, assuring them their daughters would be safe under her care. And they came, naive, hopeful, their trunks filled with silk gowns and leather-bound books. Many were no older than 14. At first, she treated them with a strange civility, as if savoring the anticipation of what she would do. Days might pass before she revealed the truth of what they had been brought there for. Some she interrogated about their family histories, their secret fears, their prayers. Others she simply observed, studying their skin and hair as though they were specimens in a private collection. When she finally tired of the pretense, her cruelty poured out in forms that defied all decency. She devised tortures with the creativity of an artist, each new act more perverse than the last. A young noblewoman, barely 15, was forced to strip and stand barefoot on a sheet of ice, while Elizabeth watched her convulse and sob until her breath failed. Another was sewn into a canvas sack and beaten, her muffled shrieks echoing through the vaulted halls. Sometimes Elizabeth ordered her servants to smear the girls with honey and leave them in the courtyard where swarms of insects would consume their flesh. Other times she insisted on personally opening their veins, pressing her palms to the wounds so she could feel the heat as life drained away. Those who served her learned to avert their eyes. To look directly at her in these moments was to witness a hunger so monstrous it could never be satisfied. But even monsters must contend with the limits of their world. As more noble families began to inquire after their missing daughters, Elizabeth's circle of protection began to crack. Rumors flowed into the capital, rumors of a castle that reeked of rot, of wagons ferrying corpses to unmarked graves in the forest, of a countess who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her beauty. Some dismissed these stories as grotesque superstition, the inevitable slander aimed at a powerful widow. Others, however, had begun to suspect that something far worse was unfolding behind the stone walls of Kachtich. It was around this time that a Lutheran pastor named Istvan Magyari stood before his congregation and dared to speak what others would not. He accused Elizabeth of mass murder, calling her a predator who preyed on the defenseless with impunity. His words carried on the wind, repeated in marketplaces and taverns, until even the royal court could no longer pretend ignorance. Yet Elizabeth remained untroubled. She believed her alliances would protect her, as they always had. When she received word that King Matthias II had commissioned an investigation, she did not flee or attempt to hide her crimes. Instead, she summoned her steward, Thurzo, and demanded he see to the castle's defenses. Thurzo was a man who had long benefited from her favor. He had managed her estates, arranged her acquisitions, buried her dead. But now he faced a choice: to stand by the woman who had elevated him beyond his station, or to save himself from her ruin. In the end, he chose the path that ensured his survival. On a freezing December night in 1610, he arrived at Kachtich under the pretext of a friendly visit. Elizabeth received him in her private chambers, unaware that a contingent of soldiers waited in the courtyard. When Thurzo gave the signal, the doors were forced open, and the castle was searched from tower to cellar. What they found defied the imagination. Some accounts claimed they discovered a girl still gasping her final breaths on a blood-stained table, her limbs twitching in agony. Others described walls slick with gore, floors littered with fragments of flesh. Dozens of bodies were exhumed from shallow graves nearby, some so badly mutilated they could only be identified by scraps of clothing. Elizabeth did not scream or protest as they catalogued the evidence. She stood motionless, her face pale but composed, as if this intrusion was merely an inconvenience. When Thurzo finally turned to her and declared she was under arrest in the name of the crown, she smiled faintly as if the charge were beneath her contempt. In the days that followed, her servants were rounded up and interrogated under torture. They spoke of everything: how Elizabeth had ordered the beatings, the burnings, the cuttings, how she had insisted on collecting the blood for her baths, how she had watched the girls die with a rapture no words could describe. The testimonies spread like plague through the kingdom, feeding the public's horror and fascination. To the peasants, she became a legend incarnate, a noblewoman so corrupted by power she had abandoned her humanity entirely. To the aristocracy, she was a scandal that threatened the stability of their entire order. In the royal court, arguments raged over how to punish her. Some demanded her execution, insisting no title should shield her from the gallows. Others feared the precedent such a sentence would set. If the crown could hang a countess, who among them was truly safe? In the end, a compromise was struck, a sentence as grotesque as the crimes it was meant to redress. Elizabeth would not die by blade or rope. Instead, she would be sealed within her own castle, entombed in the same walls that had concealed her monstrous appetites. On the appointed day, workers carried stone and mortar up the winding stairs. Elizabeth was forced into a small chamber with a single narrow slit for air and food. As they began to brick up the doorway, she watched in silence. No plea escaped her lips, no tears welled in her eyes. When the final stone was set in place, darkness swallowed her, and still she did not scream. For weeks after the last stone sealed her in, the castle corridors were haunted by the memory of her footsteps. Servants whispered that if you pressed your ear to the wall of her prison, you could hear her breathing, slow, measured, unrepentant. At night, a single candle burned behind the narrow slit, casting a sickly glow onto the passage floor, as though the darkness itself were alive and watching. They brought her food and water in small wooden bowls, slid across the threshold by trembling hands. No one spoke to her. No one dared to look through the gap for more than a heartbeat. And still she endured, her body wasting away day by day, but her will untouched. She was the last Báthory to rule these lands, and she would not let her final days be stained by fear. In the villages below, relief mingled with a horror too vast to dissipate. Mothers counted their daughters every morning, as though expecting some phantom hand to steal them away even now. Fathers carried torches past the castle gates and spat curses into the night. And still the stories grew more extravagant. Some said she was not a woman at all, but a demon who had masqueraded in human flesh. Others believed her spirit would seep into the stones, cursing the land for generations to come. Months passed, the snows melted into spring, and the peasants planted their fields again. But life could never return to what it had been. When children strayed too close to the castle walls, their elders snatched them back with trembling hands. A silence lingered around that place, a hush that no birdsong or breeze could soften. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.